All right. So I know it's like almost the end of this thing and you haven't seen me yet. So I felt like I had to make at least two, right? At least two videos so that you know I was still here. But today what I want to talk about is kind of talking about analyzing television and analyzing media. And so I want to take the topic of this idea of TV's golden age, which would be the 1950s to about 1965. And a lot of people, like if you type in the golden age of television, this is the kind of era that you'll get. And there's shows like Leave It to Beaver and My Three Sons and a lot of things like that. Gunsmoke, stuff, stuff of that nature. And while this is iconic American television, it did really change fundamentally American life. There are some other elements of that golden age that I think are important to think about and important to understand. So what is that? So what are we, kind of what are we looking at? First of all, because there was only so many television stations, the goal was to try to appeal to the broadest audience possible. Whereas today we really focus on narrow casting and getting a specific demographic for a specific show. During this era, we were trying to get the biggest, widest demographics. So oftentimes, we're really looking at the lowest common denominator for programming. How are we going to get the most number of people to watch? And so it really did limit the kinds of stories. And there was, and if you remember this from the beginning of the section, this content, the idea of the spiral of silence, where because creators were often afraid of creating certain kinds of media, because they didn't want backlash, either from the censors, who would say, no, sorry, you can't do that on television, from their advertisers, who would say, we're not going to associate our name with this content, or from viewers who might see it as unseemly or may see it as not an interesting piece. These are all pieces that would keep interesting stories beyond the norm off television in general. So it's always good to kind of know that there was a limit to the kinds of stories that you could tell during this period. Also, because of the structure of television, there oftentimes was a reliance on stereotype to tell a story in a quick manner. If you look at this, still today, we look at comedies are 30 minutes, dramas are 45, right? Well, when you're going to tell a story in that short a period of time, you need visual shortcuts. And that's usually what stereotypes are. Think about, we go back to Leave It to Beaver just because it's something that everybody has pretty much, heard of at least. You've got, Ward, the dad, who's nice and strong, and he goes to work every day and he comes home and he's kind of the stoic figure. Then you've got June, who stays home and, cleans the house in a beautiful dress in pearls somehow. I don't know how that works. And then you've got the kids who are very stereotypically boy children who kind of, operate in a very boys will be boys kind of way where they're climbing trees and getting their, their knees scraped and getting into trouble. It really is these shortcuts. We have these visual templates in our head for television families, right? So it's kind of important to think about where those stereotypes come from because, and this is why television is important. When I ask people to generate images of the 1950s, it's almost always the first thing that comes out of their head are images from these shows because television remains, right? We can still go back and look at some of those TV shows, right? And see them and watch them. And it gives us this image of life that is, certainly true for some people, but definitely not true for others, And it's really important just to kind of keep those things in mind. A lot of people, when I ask, were there single parents in the 1950s? A lot of people go, oh, no, we didn't have the problems with divorce and stuff that we do now. Well, first of all, sure we did. We had divorce. It just wasn't popularly discussed and it wasn't as socially acceptable. But also, we had a lot of widows, right? It was right after World War II. We had a lot of widows, people who lost their spouse in the war and who had to raise their kids and work outside the home. And yet those are not normally stories that you see told during this period of time because there is this ideal. And also realize that a lot of these stories were beholden to advertisers trying to associate their product with a specific show. And you want to associate your product with the nice middle class suburban white generally family down living in suburbs, not necessarily the struggling single mom who is trying to raise 3 kids on her own. So people would create these programs for those reasons. However, on the other hand, right, TV during this time did fundamentally change how we view the world. It created a collective consciousness. You could get somebody from Cincinnati and somebody from Chicago together, and they could talk about what happened on a specific television show. This is the first time we had fandoms, for lack of a better term. You had merchandise and fan clubs that you could join for certain shows, especially kids shows, that really showed that you enjoyed something. So it created this kind of collective consciousness that we still see today. It also provided a really interesting, consistent source for news and information. When you start looking at, and you saw this on a previous slide, Edward R. Murrow and Walter Cronkite, and this national level of journalism, you started to see people move their consciousness from purely local to more national. And that was a result of the advent of this golden age of television. You also saw the advent of public television, which focused on parenting and education. Why? Because during the day, you had a lot of people, women especially, who were home, right? And they might have a television on and be watching television during the day. And so you would have things on parenting. Sesame Street. This is not until the later 60s, but during this period when shows like Sesame Street start to come on, and Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and all these things, these were created to help children be educated either after school or before school. And we really saw that kids who watched these shows, especially Sesame Street, did as well as kids who went to preschool. So I thought that was kind of cool. It also created sports. So if you're a sports fan, you owe a lot of your fandom to early television because, before televised sports, there was no Super Bowl. All right. They played a Super Bowl, but like 500 people came. It's not the thing that we have today. A lot of sports that we know and love, they get their start here in this era of television where televised sports are important. So, TV's golden age is more complex than we think. And I think that it's good to understand that as we move forward with television analysis. When you're looking at your shows for your assignment, pay attention to what are some of those things from that golden age of television that still exist today. Hopefully that's helpful. See you in the next video.